of the webinar now, and the panelists have all agreed to stay with us, as has Charles. So I happy to just to remind you all, you can, by liking particular questions that are appearing on Speaker Due, you can move them up the priority list or whatever. But maybe I will begin with one of my own, using the chair's prerogative, which is going back to where Michelle finished at the notion of public goods for public money. I've heard it suggested by the farming interests that cheap food might be considered a public good. For the economists amongst us, would that meet your definitional parameters of a public good? I'm happy for anybody. Alan, are you going to come in on that?
Okay, well, I thought Michelle gave a great explanation of how economists use the term in a technical sense, what is a public good. In my view, cheap food could be an objective of public policy, but I wouldn't see it as meeting the requirements to be described as a public good in a technical sense. But sure, it can be seen as an objective of public policy. I think that's maybe a more useful way of thinking about that. That's my view. Others may disagree.
I don't know if anybody else would differ with that. John, I see you're nodding. You'd be comfortable with that perspective?
Yes.
Yeah. And Leanne similarly. Okay. One of the points which Charles makes in his paper is where he looks at agriculture and essentially shows it is a sector which is proportionately less and less significant in the Irish economy. Its percentage contribution to output is dropping as a proportion of overall value. The employment structure is dropping, the numbers of farmers are dropping, but at the same time, it's in terms of growth terms, it accounts for 50% roughly of the water courses that are under pressure and is a very major contributor to greenhouse gases. So we have this strange mix of a sector which would appear on most objective criteria to be in decline, but is actually ever present on two big parameters of environmental problem, namely water and climate. However, when you look at the paper, what it seems to me to be a bit silent on is what's the impact on the downstream food processing sectors in Ireland and on the manufacturing side of the Irish economy generally and of the rural Irish economy in particular. So, you know, we are often presented with the figure that 15% of baby formula globally is produced in Ireland. So it's a very major, or seems to me to be a very major component of the Irish economic life. So I am interested in what the panelists would take a view is if we are to somehow change those things which are produced by Irish farmers. And I noticed, Michelle, you used the word productive land. I think Charles' concept is that everything that land produces, it might be food, but it might also be other things. So wetlands could be construed as productive in that sense. But if it's not productive around basic commodities, around food, what would be the impact on downstream industry? And what would that mean in terms of the realignment of the Irish economy? Would anybody like John, would you like to come in on that one?
All right. In terms of beef, the value added is very low in the Irish economy, that the meat processing sector is very poorly paid, low value added. So if Brexit results in a major decline in that sector, yes, it will be difficult for those involved, but it's not going to impact widely on the economy. Milk, there's much higher value added in processing. It is significant, but it is still a small sector of the Irish economy. It doesn't mean that it's not important. We see how the Brexit talks are currently held up. The value added in fish, the CSO published a figure last week, the value added in fish to Ireland is 168 million. It's absolutely tiny, yet it's still important. So agriculture is very important in terms of politically and in terms of the communities. They're far more, like the value added is low in it, but it's spread out over a lot of people. So it is politically, and one must be concerned, there are a lot of people on low incomes in the sector. So this is something that we have to be concerned about. But in terms of the wider economic implications, and certainly when it comes to choices in terms of climate change or in terms of water quality, there will be no necessary sacrifice of value added to the Irish economy by changing. And one of the areas, for particular on climate change, is growing more trees or bioenergy crops. There was a study done 30 years ago by the ESRI, by Bob O'Connor and Brendan Carney, which showed that with mature forestry, the employment in the local area is the same as if you had standard agriculture. So actually changing what you do in agriculture doesn't necessarily even mean have implications in terms of the local community. And we've seen one of the big issues in Ireland is bogland, and how we use that to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And having, for my sins, gone round bogs, until COVID, I kept a pair of boots in my car to go round bogs and farms, that actually changing the bogs which have been developed commercially so they suck carbon out of the atmosphere, it actually needs to employ people. And was it 2 weeks ago, the government announced a scheme which will employ a significant number of those who are involved in harvesting peat to actually manage the bogs as an enterprise to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. So I don't think that there are necessarily economic, as measured in terms of GDP or gross value added, costs to actually making major environmental changes. I think the issues there are in terms of local communities and local individuals. So I don't see that there is a trade-off between the sort of the wider economy and improving the environment.
Thanks, John. Would anybody else like to come in on that one? So what I'm hearing you, John, is that it wouldn't have such a major impact or a transformational impact on the downstream sectors. Leanne, you wanted to come in there on that?
Yeah, because I think it raises an interesting question, which has to do with how you structure a transition period, right? So I'm not coming in strongly supporting or against what John said, but if you did think that there was going to be an effect on livelihoods, then thinking about how you structure change over time can be a really useful thing. And so with my experience working at the WTO, I'm really familiar of how at the end of the Uruguay round, a lot of the liberalization that countries that were members of the WTO agreed to do it over 5 or 8 years, for example. So there was definitely like a phase in terms of modifying, for example, tariff structures or limiting domestic support. So I just think it's useful to keep that question of the transition as part of the variables that you can play with when you're thinking about it.
And thanks, Leanne. And of course, we have some familiarity with that now with the Just Transitions project in peatlands and with the gradual, with the transitioning of the peat production company Board Mona from peat, I use the word in inverted commas, harvesting company to a more sustainable model. Alan, did you want to come in on that point, or with regard to downstream, the impacts on downstream, what the rural economy might look like if farmers switched massively to wetlands and forestry and other other sectors of production outside of dairying, in particular, tillage and beef?
Certainly, the the dualism of Irish agriculture is hugely striking. And as John points out, the dry stock enterprises simply do not give a return to the farmer. And even if prices were increased, it's still not going to be the case. So we do need to be looking at alternatives in a general sense. But maybe I could just use your question, Tom, to sort of also highlight a way in which the processing sector can actually help to drive some of the changes that we are discussing, because I think it's apparent to most of us that there are changes in consumer demands which are being reflected through the supermarket purchases, which are very concentrated sources of purchasing power, back to the processes. There are being demands put on processes to demonstrate, and the issue of credibility and verifiability comes into play here as well, but to demonstrate their sustainability credentials. And it seems to me that is an impetus, that's a driver that we should be trying to build upon, because clearly in the longer term, Irish agriculture is highly export oriented. We depend on our reputation, and if we cannot defend that in a credible way, and the statistics on water quality, your competitors are going to be very quick to use that in the marketplace as a tool against you. So we do need to use that consumer force, if you like, as part of the drivers to help to bring about the changes that are needed.
So, and of course, we should refer to the initiative of the dairy co-ops. A number of the dairy co-ops are doing precisely what you've just described, Alan, in a very interesting initiative based out of, I think, Kilkenny. Michelle, what's your view on?
I think it's not as black and white as it may seem. I mean, the scheme that we've been talking about this morning, the Burn Life project, one of the objectives of that program was to increase stocking rates on the burn to keep down scrubs. So when we look at livestock production, we have intensive dairy farms versus very extensive cattle farms. Very extensive farms are not having any impact on water quality, really. So we can't just lump them all into the one and say, they're not making money on the beef side, so that they're not as important. But there's a huge amount of land in Ireland that is taken up. So what do we do? What do we change the land use to? How do we change that? I mean, we have a climate, and we have an island. We're located that we are very favorable to livestock production in some ways. So we need to focus more on the levels of intensity that may be causing difficulties in terms of water quality, and the huge tract of land all along the west coast of Ireland that is very livestock production based, that the land is not suitable for dairying or for tillage or for more intensive types of farms. So I don't think it's as black and white as we get rid of one in favor of something else.
Okay, I don't know if anybody wants to come in on any other aspect of that, so I'll go to the next question, and I'm reading this off the screen. It's from one of the attendees, who says he or she is currently working with farmers in Roscommon. Some farmers are currently putting in place riparian zones without payment. Their biggest fear at the moment is loss of basic farm payments. A lot of what we talk about is economics. There's also a social element to this that needs to be taken into consideration. This comment or observation reminds me a little bit of, I remember a time when the big debates in Ireland were on the farmer's dole, and people objected to it at the time, not because of the amount of money involved, as much as there seemed to be a kind of a national view that it was bad for the morals of farmers to be getting money for nothing. Should we now be looking at some kind of a basic income guaranteed basic income for farmers, which I think is the underpinning question in that observation, which would guarantee a livelihood, but at the price of the production of public goods, which possibly would involve transitioning from some of the current enterprises.
Maybe I could come in there, Tom. I think there were actually two elements to the question. I mean, one is this real concern which comes up in a number of places in Charles's report, which is to do with what types of land can be eligible for your payment, and whether if you encourage, habitats that are suitable for biodiversity by letting, part of your land grow wild, if you like, is that going to make that part of your farm ineligible? So that, as I say, is something which I see has been raised in the negotiations on the next CAP reform in Brussels. So I would be hopeful that there will be some movement. Of course, what happens in Brussels has to be translated into specific rules and regulations in an Irish context. So a lot will depend on how our own department interprets these rules. But the new CAP will give much greater flexibility for stakeholders in Ireland to be able to influence these regulations in the future. It's not a question of simply taking what Brussels says, as was the case in the past. The other issue in terms of basic income support, I mean, I think this is certainly an idea which should be explored, but I come back to a point which Charles made in his presentation, that it really doesn't seem to make sense to just focus on one particular part of a household's income. I mean, if you're talking about basic income support, you are concerned about low-income households, and one really should be looking at the total household income. And we have very good schemes in Ireland which do that, and which in my view work well. So I'm not sure there is that sort of any longer that opposition, if you like, that you highlighted from some time ago, Tom. Yeah.
How would farmers, Michelle, that you're working with react to the notion of a guaranteed basic income, and what would it mean for them in terms of their enterprise choices, do you think?
I think once again we're back to huge differences across farming systems and different farmers, and we didn't actually ask farmers those sort of questions in the survey, so to be only my own opinion here. But I think farmers are that we think that farmers are very disengaged from environment. I mean, I don't think there is any other sector that depends so much on the environment for every single thing that they do, and they're very aware of their, like, agriculture is so regulated. They're very aware all the time of the regulations that are in place, of their role that they have to play. And because at the end of the day, environmental degradation will affect how their income and how they live and how they can continue into the future. And so farmers are also looking to succession and passing on. And so all down through history in Ireland, we've had the importance of land and within families and of passing it on in better condition to the next generation. So I think they're very in favor of anything that will help them to survive as they are in farming and be able to pass on to their children the farms that they've inherited.
I'm interested in what you said there, Michelle, that you think farming is highly regulated. John, in your presentation, this was something you speculated a bit about around the requirements for regulation, etc. Would you take the view that farming is a highly regulated sector in Ireland?
I'm quite happy to take what Michelle. I'm not a farmer. I'm a Dubliner, so not for me to comment on it. I thought one of the things that Leanne said, which I think is important, that you don't transition suddenly. That you're dealing with people like me who are over 70, a lot of them, and they're not suddenly going to stop being farmers and become foresters overnight. So I think that the issue, yes, the cap needs to move to paying for things that the public needs in terms of the environment. But farming has been based on the basic income that is there on the continuing farm payments. So to abolish them, as the British are doing, and move suddenly to a regime that they haven't been able to define is not the way to go. So I think I would expect the next cap will not see farmers losing their basic incomes, but I think it will see incentives to actually make some changes over the rest of the day. Well, I think with the next cap, will it be for 7 years or whatever? So I think we plan to evolve agriculture, not for a revolution. The British solution, they haven't been able to make it work out what they want. And to try and do that with the farming community, with a load of people like me, who are not going to change overnight, I think would be asking for trouble. So I would expect to see evolution, not revolution.
And I'm going to ask Leanne or maybe to come in on that one, but I would also like to wonder about when we talk about terms of the farming community, I'm always struck by farming as, you know, what we used to be taught in rural sociology 40 years ago was that every farmer is an independent decision maker. And there are farmers within the community with different interests, and sometimes they're oppositional to other farmers. So the idea of a homogenous farming community is really, it seems to me, you know, you'd have to wonder out loud about it and wonder about the different interests within the farming world. And right now in Ireland, there's a very intensive dairying, profitable sector. And the rest of it is pretty much unprofitable from what I can see. In Europe, Leanne, or on a wider scale, what are those kind of tensions and how are they being manifested? And who within the farming sector are likely to have their interests served, and who within the farming sector are likely not to have their interests served, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, just if I can go sideways for a second, what I was thinking about listening to the discussion was from a policymaker's perspective, you know, you have a bundle, you have a budget, and you have to allocate your money across a bunch of different priorities. So you're looking at these different triple challenge objectives, which include farmer livelihood. So you want to make sure that you're making, you know, you have the right weight on that objective, but you're also trying to have these longer term goals, which require a different kind of investment. So what was in my mind was this thing about the trade-offs between how you handle the immediate, for example, the immediate objective of making sure that livelihoods are sustained in some way, with the longer term objective of making sure that the sector is, that enough investment is going into the longer term sector issues like sustainability, for example, or climate change reduction. So I know this isn't exactly where your question was headed, but I think it's an important question around trade-offs, right? That it's kind of the near term and the long term, and as a policy, like putting the policy package together, you have to strike that balance, like between that. And I guess maybe that, yeah, doesn't, yeah, I think I'll stop there.
No, that's fine, Leanne. Michelle, I'm going to come to you. When I again, working from memory, back in the last century, a group of colleagues from your own organisation, Rural Economy Section in Teagasc, then it was called Fóras Uisce, which was the research side of arm of what has now become Teagasc, focused on they differentiated between 4 types of farmer in Ireland, in my recollection, which they referred to as the modernising, the intermediate, the traditional, and the habitual. And the modernising was what you might put in inverted commas, the good farmer, somebody who was tuned in to the need for nitrates, phosphates, and EU supports, and was an agentic farmer in every sense. The intermediate was a bit there and a bit in the past. The traditional was somebody who was working out of a past model, And the habitual was somebody who got up in the morning and let life happen to him or to her. There was a very strong and very clear sense, I think, as to what constitutes a good farmer. What today is a good farmer?
I'm not sure anyone could answer that question. I think, you know, even outside of farming, I think you could probably apply those different definitions to all of us. Within all of society, there will always be the ones, and it'll come down to risk and, you know, our preferences for risk. Are we willing to take a risk? Are we willing to sit back and let everyone else, you know, do it first, or do we not care? What makes a good farmer? I think what a lot of farmers, and if farmers are listening in this morning, they will all probably agree that if you have enough good land, then your choices are very different than if you have a small farm that's very limited. So and if you have the resources to do all the to implement all the different different elements that may or may not, if you are the leader, if you are the one that's out front, you don't really have anything to go on to say, well, if we do this, we will have these results. So that will always be down to more personalities, I think, than whether you're a good farmer or not, and whether people are willing to take risks and or not. Does that answer your question, Tom?
Well, I'm interested in, I think, you know, the model of farming that has evolved in Ireland is very recent. It's even in you know, Ireland, UK, it's a post-World War II model of farming. The use of high inputs around nitrates or artificial fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, monocultural approaches to production. These are all very, I'm struck by the fact that these are very recent developments. But their impact has been so huge environmentally. And when we talk about a transition away from them, we're really only 1 or 2 generations into that model of agriculture in Ireland. And I am really interested in how attached we have become to what looks like a fairly singular model. But Charles, you were asked the question on the screen about ASAP, and indeed you referred to others such as the Bride Project and the Fóram Project about mainstreaming of some of these projects. I know from the forums, from the work of the Fóram, that it is always excited by pilot projects and also simultaneously frustrated by them because they see them as tokenistic and as a little bit ritualistic, and maybe not ever giving a guide to a future that is going to be observed more in not being realized than in being realized, which is a bit maybe negative way of looking at it. How would you see, or have you reflected on the mainstreaming of some of the good practices that you refer to in case studies in your study?
Well, that's a good question. And I think Michelle highlighted what makes those pilots work so well is the fact that they have very clear and achievable KPIs and observable KPIs. And the Burn Project and the Bride Project, they show, in addition to the effectiveness of having a results-based system with clear and observable KPIs, but it also shows the importance of farmer peer-to-peer networks and trust systems. And in the case of the Bride Project, the use of ICT technology for monitoring. And I think what can be done from those is that while there are unique conditions involved in both of them, it's to take away those universal aspects, which is that there needs to be more peer-to-peer learning. There needs to be issues of trust developed between farm advisors and the farming community, as well as the department, and that there is a need for data, and that things are data-led. And Michelle highlighted it, and it was highlighted by Alan and others, is this need to develop this base of analytical tools, and some of them are quite forward-looking, like the LiDAR analysis. And if as my background is mostly in finance, so if you look at how agricultural commodities are treated on commodity markets, especially from the US sources, this role of continuously monitored technology is very much part of how the Chicago Mercantile Exchange works. And it's trying to get farmers to evolve into thinking that way. And John's point about age is very much important in that space. I saw one of the questions relates to the Teagasc Farm Survey on the age of farmers, and the finance bill has worked very hard on trying to encourage younger farmers, but the reality is that farms transfer very infrequently in Ireland, and farmers are not very young. It's not a terribly attractive career pathway for individuals, even in rural Ireland, and that limits the extent to which these new ideas and new projects and new technologies can be taken up. I would just highlight as well that while John quite appropriately highlights the role of forestry and how that can be used as a way of securing positive income and more secure income into the future, there is this trust issue there. And the analysis that we saw showed that there was a building up of distrust amongst the farming community because of the way in which the environmental schemes that related to forestry were implemented. And it's taking a very long time to build that back. And that's, again, part of the very important things that have been seen in the Burn project and the Bride project is the ability to develop farmer trust, that they become co-productionists with the people leading these projects. And it's getting farmers back onto that page that you can begin to have a more serious conversation about implementing these changes. Michelle is right. The majority of farmers are actually very in tune with what is happening on their land, but they are also very in tune with what the market is demanding of them, and they can't continuously see shrinking farm gate incomes. And that is part of that wicked problem situation that a systems approach highlights. And it also highlights the fact that you have to be very slow in changing these behaviors. It can't be instant. And I fully take on board the comments about the Agricultural Act 2020 in the United Kingdom. They're obviously going to think that they're going to figure out everything in the statutory instruments, but British policymaking seems to be a mystery to me in many ways. So, but I'll leave it there to you, Tom.
Okay, it does raise a point, though, which is that, and it's a point which farming interests on the Fórum repeatedly make, which is that if they're to farm organically or farm sustainably, remove some of the non-sustainable elements from their practice, A, the consumer cannot afford the additional price, and B, the difference between costs of production sustainably as opposed to the costs of imported goods, which may not be subject to any similar regulations. This makes it even less attractive and less feasible. And one of the points you make in your report, Charles, is the notion that it's difficult for farmers to be green if they're farming in the red. And there is a strong sense amongst the farming interest that I hear, basically suggesting that sustainability equates to farming in the red, because it removes the economies of scale. It has big labor inputs, and the consumer demand is not there to pay the difference between sustainable products and products that are produced intensively. But does anybody have any views on that?
Well, I'll jump in first, and then I'm sure much more intelligent comments will come from the panel. But in terms of of that question of, farming for the environment, is it farming in the red? And this, I think, gets to a lot of the questions of the efficacy of subsidies versus regulation. And Alan and John very nicely rehearsed the public policy discussions on that. And for many people in the farming community, its regulations are a matter of internalizing the costs onto themselves. And in many cases, they don't have the opportunity to pass on that cost to the consumer or to the intermediate producer. And that's something which it comes through in some of the work that we did for this project. It is very much what, in my own experience when I was working in the Oireachtas, came across in the development of new European regulations. Is every regulation has some type of cost. Who's going to wind up paying that cost? Will it be passed on to the final consumer? Will it be eaten by the individual, or will it be a reduction in the profits for the intermediate wholesalers? And that's something which needs to be thought out a bit more fully and fully understood. And for many of those who are not in the high income dairy sector, there really isn't the capacity to have any of your margin eaten into. And that's something that needs to be taken into account, and moves that conversation towards that idea of, well, then what are you going to subsidize people for if you do want them to be green, if there is no capacity for them to shift the cost of that regulation either internally to themselves or to final consumers and intermediates. So I'll leave it over to
Alan, did you want to come in on that?
People.
Yeah, I think it's really important to take Michelle's point on board here that, farming is not homogeneous, and that, the more profitable sector, particularly the dairy sector, not only can, but should be expected to take into account the external costs of dairy expansion, whether it's increased greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's increased nutrient loading with the potential for adverse water quality. So if people are thinking of moving into dairying, and we've seen that happening, that decision should be taken in the light of the full costs. So the farmers need to be aware of the fact that the nitrates regulation, the derogation is up for review next year. It may not be continued because we don't have a very good track record, as you pointed out, Tom. So for the profitable part of dairying, of farming, I think the situation with respect to sustainability is very different to the lower income part. But as Michelle has pointed out, the environmental consequences there are often positive. We're not talking about sustainability as a cost. We're talking about sustainability as a contribution, which to date has not got the proper recognition. Certainly there's the possibility through more smart use of CAP funding to reward that sustainability contribution, whether it's to biodiversity, to landscapes, to flood protection, or whatever, in the less intensive parts of farming. So I'm not sure I buy the argument that there's this inevitable trade-off between livelihoods or profitability and sustainability.
Okay. Leanne, do you want to come in there?
Do I want to come in there? I was thinking about a lot of things that have come up over this discussion, and one of the things I think was the question of what are consumers willing to pay for. And I think Alan made the comment in a previous round of questions about are consumers, can you somehow mobilize the consumer values around sustainability to be able to make sure that somehow the prices that are being sold of products being sold in supermarkets, for example, actually reflect the characteristics of production that consumers are wanting to support. And again, I think Alan already made this point. It comes down to sort of verifiability and data and systems to making sure that you can track and create the trust so that a consumer would actually feel like they're getting what they're paying for, if that's how the prices move.
Dawn, if I can direct that question to you in a slightly different way, which came from the attendees, and it's a statement on the question, as all good questions are, John, and it says, what was designed as a good value food policy has developed into a cheap food policy. Do you think consumers would pay full price of production? Other alternatives are to drop all support and regulation or import all food. End quote.
First of all, as I said, European policy has not been a cheap food policy since its foundation. The protections on European agriculture from imports are lower, much lower than they were, but they're still very significant, in particular in terms of beef. So it's not a cheap food policy. I think the issues of distributional effects in individual countries have nothing to do with food prices, that food prices should reflect the cost of production, as the cost of cars should reflect the cost of production. It is up to the welfare systems of countries to protect those on low incomes. So I think this issue of a cheap food policy is a distraction. I think that food should reflect the cost of production. I think sometimes in the farming community, they say, well, people aren't prepared to pay the price of certain, say, organically produced food. And that's true. That's consumers making a choice, and you can't constrain consumers. If all of the food has to be produced consistent with not polluting the watercourses, and that impose costs, the cost of production go up and consumers will have to pay it. So I think that this issue of cheap food policy is a complete distraction. I think welfare policy is to do with the welfare of people on low incomes in individual countries. Here we're talking about the production side, and there are issues in terms of fairness to farmers, and which went back to earlier in terms of a guaranteed income or the continuing farm payments, single farm payments. Yes, there are issues there in terms of the income of individual households, and Alan has talked about the complexity of that issue. But I think this issue of cheap food versus expensive food is a distraction.
Okay, thanks, John. Can I ask the panel? I accept that Charles' paper shows the complexity of the questions that we're dealing with. It demonstrates that this is a real, as Charles used the term, it's a wicked policy issue. But are there any overarching things you would like to see in the new CAP that might optimize environmental outcomes? Are there any obvious suggestions that you would say, if you were in there for 24 hours, this is what you would do? Alan, can I give you that job in the first instance? And
well, I wanted to come back actually on the earlier discussion
please do,
you were having with Charles about the difficulties of scaling up pilot projects, because I think that's highly relevant to agri-environment schemes. And I'd be interested really to hear Michelle's view on this. But to me, one approach would be in the next round of CAP programs to put greater emphasis and to give, maybe a premium in terms of support to what you might call collective actions by farmers. In other words, group activities. I mean, both of the pilot schemes that have been highlighted are precisely group schemes. So in other words, instead of focusing all of the effort on individual farms and individual farms enrolling in the scheme and getting a payment in return for following certain management practices, what I understand is more the Dutch approach to agri-environment, where you really try to work through collective groups of farmers, which also has environmental benefits, because you then are able to sort of get landscape scale changes in some of the environmental issues, not just on-farm changes. The collective approach also has the benefit that farmers are able to support each other, to learn from each other. So I think, as I say, trying to provide some kind of additional payment to collective types of approaches on top of what a farmer might be given, as I say, for individual participation, is maybe one way of trying to move the pilot scheme towards more mainstreaming. Oh, if I could, there was one other point which refers to, in my opening contribution, I tried to highlight, some of the potential opportunities in the new CAP, and these are potential because it will entirely depend on how we in Ireland translate those opportunities into our CAP strategic plan and the targets that we set for ourselves, and the way in which we design the interventions and use the CAP funds to achieve those targets. And as I mentioned, one of the innovations in this so-called green architecture are these eco schemes. And it does appear as if there will be some minimum ring fencing, that is to say, a minimum share of the Pillar 1 direct payments will be allocated to these eco schemes. One of the sort of perverse incentives here is that unlike in the rural development programs, where you roll out a scheme over a period of years, and also farmers sign up for a period of years, and are, in a sense, once you are accepted on the scheme, you then know that for the 5 years or whatever the length of the program, you will be guaranteed the payment, provided, of course, you observe the conditions of the scheme. But with these eco schemes, these are annual payments. And the question is, how can we design annual payments in a way that actually gives long-term benefits to the environment? The Commission seems to be suggesting that it might be appropriate to use these new eco schemes to fund, for example, the transition to organic farming, to fund agroforestry, to fund carbon farming. But all of these are long-term commitments by a farmer. And I cannot see that a farmer will be attracted into such a scheme on the basis of an annual payment that may well not be there next year. You do need a much greater certainty, it seems to me. So I do worry that yes, there are these innovations in the new CAP which potentially can be beneficial for environmental outcomes. But they're not ideal, and as I say, it really will depend on how we in Ireland translate these opportunities into interventions in our strategic plan. But as I say, I'd be interested in the idea of the collective approach, what Michelle, because you have been working with groups of farmers in your catchments, whether you think that's something which has the potential to be scaled up.
I think it's hugely important, the collective and farmers in an area, and also that they have involvement in the scheme from the start. So every farmer in every area, no one knows their land and their area better than they do. And so within the catchments, we have 6 different catchments, but the farmers in each individual catchment are dealing with very different issues on the ground. So they're dealing with different soil types. And we have a catchment up in Mayo that's on a karst landscape. They have different landscapes again. So if it's hugely important, the collective, but it also makes it more difficult in that they need to be tailored then for the individual areas and the different problems that are in that individual area. And then you need to get buy-in from the farmers in that locality. And rather than coming in and saying, this is what you have to do, we need to ask them, what is it that you want to do? And I think we probably have evidence from a lot of the EIPs that are out there at the minute, and the Bride project is an EIP, of course, where they're being developed from the bottom up instead of from the top down, and there's potential, I think, for improvements in those areas as well. Yeah.
Leanne, in your experience, this notion of bottom up. I'm interested in the overlap between private return and public return. Maybe the dichotomy between private goods and public goods might be too sharp. Maybe there is an area of overlap between a private good and a public good, which some of the work that Charles describes in his case studies, work which Michelle has just been outlining, maybe provides for some opportunities for win-win solutions, public and private. Do you see anything worth exploring in that context? If I can give you one, I'm struck, for instance, in this regard in Ireland by the group water scheme sector, where I just noticed one of the comments is that they're able to get farmers to protect the water sources for group schemes, which farmers do largely, from what I understand, at their own expense. So there's an interesting area where the common good and private good to some extent overlap. Is this governance of environmental management an issue which the OECD gives much thought to or reflection on?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, the OECD has lots of different areas of work that's relevant to this. Maybe one of the things, as you were talking, that I was thinking about was what do you need in place in order to have those kinds of collective action projects be successful? What kind of information do farmers need? Are they getting the information do they need? What kind of monitoring do you need so that the group coheres around the objective together? You know, there must be some kind of monitoring so that everybody feels that the actions that individuals are taking are consistent with what they've said that they're going to take. And, you know, there's certainly been work at the OECD around that kind of thing. I think the collective action approach to environmental problems, like people have already said, seems to have a lot of promise. Because when you break it down to individual incentives, yeah, from analysis that I've seen, it closes down the things that you think of, and when you start to make links among groups of people, then you're sort of drawing the boundary bigger and looking at the problem more holistically and seeing more of the trade-offs.
Yeah. And that brings me, John, I don't want to put you on the spot in terms of your role as chair of the Climate Council, but Climate Advisory Council, but I'm going to anyway, which is, I'm interested in whole of government approaches to these issues. Right now, as we know, the CAP is in the domain of the Department of Agriculture, the River Basin Management Plan is in the domain of the Department of the Environment, and climate is in yet another department, as I recall. Has the council given any thought or reflection to this notion of whole of government approaches to environmental outcomes?
Yes, short answer is yes, we've given some consideration of this. I think the Climate Action Plan published by the government last year represented a major leap forward in this regard. You're right that the Department of Climate doesn't have power over the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Transport. Now there is a coordination group in the Taoiseach's department, and the previous Taoiseach and the current Taoiseach take this issue very seriously. So I think we will see greater coordination. Also, I was surprised, I think one of you said about how the farming community isn't really aware of the environmental issues. In my extensive interaction with both the Department of Agriculture and the farming community, they are probably more aware than most other government departments of the environmental imperative and what's coming down the tracks. So in terms of the CAP reform, I think it is important that it is a government issue. It is not a Department of Agriculture issue, although I think the Department of Agriculture are already on the case on this issue. But I think that the benefits from reform of the CAP will have major implications in terms of the climate objectives we have set ourselves. So I think that the CAP reform, we will all be watching it. And I think other government, the Department of Climate, the Department of Taoiseach, Department of Finance, because it will have long-term financial implications, will be looking at this issue, because 1/3 of our emissions of greenhouse gases come from agriculture. So if we are to get to net zero, however it is defined, by 2050, there has to be major changes in agriculture. And the work we've done so far suggests there can be major changes in agriculture which will contribute to a solution without having a serious negative impact on farmers' incomes and very possibly increase them. And the final point I'd say, I think the point Alan makes about the long-term nature of the change, if you're asking farmers to go out and plant trees, and they're going to harvest them at different points, but the full benefit of that will come in 30 years' time when probably the farmer is dead. It'll be their children who benefit it. You can't buy into a scheme which is there for 5 or 7 years. And in the case of, say, beef, which you want people to move out of, there is a market there. Farmers understand, and it may be on a very unfavorable market. There isn't the same market in terms of the alternative sources. So I think how we structure this so that farmers will see this is a long-term viable solution, it's not just a one-off. I think that's a very important point that Alan raised.
Yeah, I noticed you nodding in the affirmative as Alan was raising it, John. And it's probably something I think that as a forum we would be keen to take on board, that the economic returns should not be in the dim and distant future. They need to be immediate to be convincing. Farmers have probably more grounds for skepticism on public policy proclamations than most interest groups. Michelle, one question that came on the screen for you is the learning from the ACP. You might just fill the attendance in on a little on the agricultural catchments program, how long it's been running, and where it's headed, and how in particular you see it coexisting with, for instance, the third cycle of the River Basin Management Plan.
Yeah, so the ACP, it's a very unique program, I think, and it has huge potential to deliver so many benefits in this area, because we not alone have me looking at the economic side of it and farmer behavior side of it, and adaptation, and how we can encourage farmers to take on the measures that the scientists in the program are saying are the ones that we need to use best. And because we have in each catchment area, so there are 2 based in Wexford with 2 very different soil types, and there's a catchment in Cork that's very an intensive catchment, and then there are 2 catchments in the northeast, again with different soil types and different conditions and different weather conditions, and we have a catchment in Mayo that's on a karst landscape. So we have data collected on, I think, every 10 minutes on the water side at the outlet that's coming out of that catchment. So we have a huge, rich data set there of all the changes that are happening in water quality as they're happening. It's a huge resource to have. And hand in hand with that, we carry out soil testing on those different farms. So, and we have, what we're doing is we're building up this hugely rich data set that is drawn from all the different aspects. on top of that, there are weather stations in all of the catchments as well. So we have the weather data, we have the water data. We're hoping to add into that, we'll have the gaseous emissions data that's going to be collected by Eddie Covarian's towers into the catchments down in Wexford. And all the time it's a learning process. But what's hugely important is that we have the input of those farmers in those areas. So for example, when the researchers are out on the farms in Wexford or Cork, they're meeting with the farmers. And farmers buy in and they give voluntarily to our program year in, year out. And so I think in the future we're building in the next element, which is the gaseous emission side of it. But we're also working with the EPA and with the Department of Agriculture in developing just not our own, as I think Charles mentioned earlier on. We're not working in silos anymore. And there are so many people now working in the water quality area. So we have the Law Pro in Law Pro on their side, and we have within Chagas the ASAP advisors, the sustainability advisors working. So everybody is working together. We're all working for the same aims and the same ambitions. We all want the same outcomes. So we all need to share our joint join up the dots, if you like, and join up all the different elements to all the different research that's going on in different places. Because at the end of the day, it benefits all of us. This is the public good that we're all talking about all morning, and it benefits everybody, not just the farmers on the ground. So does that make it a little bit clearer, Tom?
Yes, thank you. It's clearly another part of an important learning zone for what the future might look like. We're coming to the end of our webinar. I would just like to ask the panel, each member, if there's any particular message they would like to convey that they've either taken for the morning or they would like to leave the attendees with. I might, Leanne, ask you in the first instance. You have the great advantage of not being from here. I think from a personal level, I'm obviously interested in how a forum like this works in terms of dealing with complex issues of where different interest groups are, in a sense, around the bargaining table to share out the costs of saving the environment amongst them. So I'm particularly interested in any insights you have on that front, but then more generally and with regard to what you've heard over the last couple of hours.
What I've been reflecting on is how this is such a good example of drawing out the facts, the interests, and the values, because we've heard people talking about the data and the importance of having evidence to make sure that you can calibrate the policies towards the objectives that you want. We've also heard a lot about interests. So what's important for the livelihoods of farmers in the sector. And then really the values have also been coming through in terms of how farming and agriculture fits into the Irish context and what that means. So so I've been really pleased to be a part of the dialogue, because I think that this is one of the mechanisms that allows more coherent policies and figuring out where these synergies and trade-offs are across the different objectives. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Leanne. Michelle, can I go to you?
Probably what comes across today for me is that there's nothing simple here. There are no quick and easy fixes. And that there are a lot more actors in this space than just farmers, and we have to recognize the good work that they do as well as the work that needs to be done in the future.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Alan, what would you be taking from the session?
Certainly that the problem is a complex one. I think Charles used the term a wicked problem, but I think we do need to underline that change is necessary. I mean, we are not in a good position with respect to water quality. The one indicator which is mandated to be used in the next CAP is this gross nutrient balance, in other words, the nitrogen and phosphorus surplus, and certainly for nitrogen, we're going in the wrong way. That's increasing, particularly in the dairy areas. So we do need a step change in the next CAP. And my message has been that although there's a lot of criticism, particularly about the sort of environmental watering down, and we've seen indeed even threats by the Vice President of the Commission, Frans Timmermans, to withdraw the proposal for the next CAP because he is concerned that the amendments that both the Council and Parliament have proposed may weaken some of that environmental and climate ambition. But I would be hopeful that when we do see the final outcome, it will be up to us in Ireland, and this is my message, to ensure that our CAP strategic plan sets ambitious targets, designs the right interventions, and allocates the resources necessary to achieve those objectives using the funds that we have available. Thanks.
John, can I come to you?
I agree with everything that Alan said. The one thing, my concern is that because the reform of the CAP has been delayed, that we're delaying the start of action. I think that where possible, we need to, and the farming community needs to evolve towards the coming incentives of the CAP, which won't be a revolution, but we need to evolve pretty rapidly over the coming decade. So I agree with Alan.
John. And Charles, you want to?
Well, I would agree with everything that's been said so far, and I think that one of the crucial things is to look at some examples that are out there. We didn't get a chance to discuss it, but the reforms that were made in Switzerland to their agricultural policies are a very good example from which Ireland could learn for the Department of Agriculture's strategy. I think there's a lot to be learned from what will be happening in England as they try to implement the policy of public goods for public monies in their Agriculture Act, and see how they correct for their errors. And the Swiss one is very important because it addresses that issue of values. It looked at transition periods, of how to change over time, of changing the values and the understanding between agricultural production and the consumption habits and demands of consumers. And then there's the multidisciplinarity aspect, which Michelle has done a wonderful job of highlighting. And I think that's crucial for this to be successful in Ireland. It's useful that this is being driven by the Department of Taoiseach. But I would also note that there are very different viewpoints. So I mentioned Tim Lang in my presentation. Tim Lang is from a public health background, and there's been a continuous argument between him and the economics community on what constitutes the appropriate policy pathways with respect to food and farming in the United Kingdom. And part of that debate is about perspectives about, well, what matters most, and the evidence that Leanne mentions from the OECD modeling, as well as what John was mentioning about the issue of cheap food policy versus expensive food policy. A lot of that needs to be teased out in that multidisciplinary environment, and that was an active argument in the Gordon Brown number 10 a couple of years ago, and it's still an active argument on Downing Street about that pathway. And it's partly informed what Dieter Helm has done. But overall, I think the key takeaway is that we have a moment for reform that we cannot delay because of the external pressures that exist in climate as well as biodiversity, and that if there is to be a progress, it will have to be as part of an exercise of trust and knowledge co-production from the ground up, involving farmers and being sympathetic to the positions and the external and internal stressors facing the farming community as well as Irish society at large. And that is a role which a forum like the Irish Water Forum will play an active and important role and communicate what is necessary to policymakers in the civil service as well as in the Oireachtas.
Thank you, Charles. This largely brings us to an end to the event. I will spare you having to listen to a summary of it. I'm struck by so many challenges and so many difficulties confronting the country in aligning or realigning a whole sector around, as Leanne said, around a particular set of values and particular policy outcomes. I point out that, as is often pointed out at the forum, of course, that there is a legislative requirement with regard to Ireland and Europe generally around the Water Framework Directive with regard to water quality. So in some senses, it has moved from being simply a value which might be defined as a notion of the good to actually a requirement around objectives around water quality. So we have been aware, I think, in the forum that there's a whole raft of farm and agricultural policies that maybe with a bit of tweaking or redirection might align the sector more definitively with the outcomes as provided for in the Water Framework Directive. And that is, in a sense, what the research we asked Charles to conduct was about. And it's clearly a debate that we will continue in the forum. I am struck by the fact that we need to make sustainable farming in the way Alan described it as something that is a lot more desirable, and not just economically, but also socially, and even in terms, I think, of aligning perhaps our research focus and our education focus around what it means to farm sustainably. I don't know what the curricula, for instance, in agricultural colleges are, or if a farmer is doing the Green Cert. I presume there are some elements to sustainability involved in all of those activities. Clearly, it is also a process of dialogue. And the forum is a place where that dialogue can happen. We try to do it in a way that is mutually respectful, that listens to people's views and tries to take on board the different approaches. But meanwhile, of course, there is a huge concern shared throughout the forum, not just with nutrient pollution in waters, but I would also draw attention to pesticides and herbicides. And in waters, the buildup of those, we know we cannot remove them from water. We can dilute them, but we cannot remove them. So these are also part of the challenge we are confronting. So in one sense, it's an environmental health issue, obviously, but it's also even a public health issue. So these are the domains and the dimensions that we're working on. I want to close this by thanking, first of all, everybody who attended. It's a slightly surreal process of a webinar. I gather there's 288 people out there in cyberspace connected into this, and your input and questions through the process have been noted and greatly valued, and I hope you felt that the points you were raising were brought to the attention of the panel. I want in a very particular way to thank Charles and the panel. We got an extraordinary mix of talent, expertise and insight to present at today's webinar, and I am deeply appreciative to Alan, John, Leanne, Michelle, and obviously Charles for the work you've done in, as Liana said, in distinguishing facts from interests and from values, and we'll certainly take that point away with us today. I want to conclude by thanking the team who organised this. They are my own colleagues on the forum. There's 26 or 7 of us drawn from multiple sectors in the Irish, on the Irish landscape. As I said, regardless of their interests, they always manage to be courteous, respectful and good listeners. So I really want to acknowledge the membership here. And then a very particular thanks to the people on the team who organised it, Donald Purcell, Alec, Angelo, but maybe a particular thanks to Greta McCarran, who brought this webinar together. And who managed to bring all of these people together from different parts of the world for this occasion. Our next webinar we will devote to peatlands. They came up today from John mentioned them and Alan, and we're doing some research at the moment on what peatlands can do in terms of water quality, but obviously listening to John earlier, the climate council are looking at them in a very particular way around carbon sequestration as well. So we hope to do that in March, and we will communicate with all of you. I want to close by thanking the Department of the Environment, many of whom are here with us, who sponsor the forum and who, with whom we have ongoing really positive interaction. Just to remind you that in early January now, probably we will at the next draft third cycle of the River Basin Management Plan will be published. We will be all taking obviously a hugely keen interest in this, and it will be the guideline or provide the parameters with which the forum will do its work over the coming years. So with that, I will close. Again, my thanks to all of you, and hopefully maybe in a post-COVID context, we might meet in a more real environment than the one we just done. But it's been a great pleasure, and thank you.